Welcome back to Reels Like the First Time. Gonna do it again because now I'm all flustered. Take it. Whew. Here we go. Whew. Got it. Welcome back for another episode of Reels Like the First Time. My journey to experience everything that film has to offer, the good and the bad, all for the very first time. I'm your host, Allison Salamone, and joining me today to discuss George Romero's directed Night of the Living Dead is a returning guest. You heard his voice back when we were audio only on, I want to say maybe the fourth episode of this podcast where we discussed Citizen Kane. He is a film critic over at The Wrap, and he's also one of the co-hosts for the podcast, critically acclaimed. This was a mess, but it's okay. It's the one and only William Bibbiani. Hello, sir.
Hey, everybody. If you've ever heard my podcast, you know that we whiff it half the time and we just keep running.
It is what it is at that point.
We just keep going. Everyone here wants to be here. We're all happy. It's cool.
We keep it real. Hello. Welcome back. I'm super excited to have you. I always love having you on because the movies that we end up discussing, I think Citizen Kane has been one of my favorite discussions so far on this podcast. Definitely up in the top 5 for me for episodes to record, just because of your knowledge and what you bring to the table with it. So having you back on and discussing something that I honestly, even knowing the history of Night of the Living Dead, I never really thought I would cover it on this show. And that's what I'm saying. What's so funny is before I even, right when I was messaging with you about having you come back on, and you had mentioned how there was very little horror on my list, a week or so prior to that, my husband actually asked me why I haven't done Night of the Living Dead yet. And I was like, well, why don't you join me? And he went, nope, I'm not doing video. And I said, maybe someone else will. And literally I heard back from you.
It was kismet.
It really was, because then I sent him the list that you had sent me, and I was like, look what's on this list. And he was like, you have to do Night of the Living Dead. So here we are. And kind of just going into that first question is, when you sent me your list of horror films, Night of the Living Dead was pretty high on that list. So what is it about this movie that you wanted to really come on and discuss it with me?
I think Night of the Living Dead, I think there's certain movies. One of the things I love about your show, let me start there. One of the things I love about your show is that I think a lot of people can be a little snobbish about motion pictures. And I think some people can be a little proud of not knowing a lot about motion pictures. And I think what you're doing is you're opening up about the process of learning more. And I think that's exciting. And I think when you watch a film, you want to share it with people. You want to hear other people's opinions. We both saw the same movie, but we both took away different things. This is part of the fun of it. This is part of the excitement of it. Night of the Living Dead is a movie that, for me, and I know for quite a few other people, is a very sort of seminal experience. It's a breakaway hit for a variety of reasons, which I know we're going to talk about. It's not entirely original, but it kind of codified a brand new genre that we now take completely for granted. And watching it in its original form and realizing just how fresh it feels to this day, just how frightening it is to this day, I think it's really important, because I think there's a lot of movies, especially genre films, which newer audiences can take them a little longer to get on board with, just because styles have changed, visual effects have changed, storytelling tropes have changed. But there are some where you go back and it's just like, wow, this is still great. This is still significant. I can see why, if this was made today, we would be talking about it. And Night of the Living Dead is just one of those special movies. It's frightening. It's smart. It's kind of got everything you would want in a horror movie. And I still remember watching this for the very first time. It's one of those, I don't remember watching every single great movie for the very first time. Like, I couldn't necessarily tell you where I was when I first saw Singing in the Rain. But I remember where I was when I first saw Night of the Living Dead. And I was like sitting in my living room, like 3 feet from the TV, totally transfixed, middle of a Sunday morning. And when it was done, and the ending is very bleak, I just sort of turned that off and staggered into the hallway, and then just went into my bedroom, closed the door, put a chair up against the door. It's like, I was young, but like, it was just sort of like, well, we're all screwed. Everything's really bad forever, and there's no hope.
That's
and the absolute nightmares are true. Okay, I'll just
your reaction to
that's life now.
To watching Night of the Living Dead is the exact same reaction that I had at 15 years old watching The Ring in theaters. I came home and I slept with all my lights on. I turned my computers off. Like I not just off, I unplugged. I turned the screen around. I'm like, you ain't gonna get me, bitch.
It's such a special experience to have a movie really frighten you that much. It's not necessarily fun in the moment, but we look back and we go, wow, that one really got me, didn't it?
Yeah.
And I think the last movie I had where I was like, I literally watched the movie and I was just like, nope, lights on, was probably Paranormal Activity. Okay. I think that one really creeped me out in a very realistic way. But not realistic, but like in a very
those are the ones that I don't fuck with. Like I told you too when you would ask like why I didn't have a whole lot of horror on my list, and I just said like it's just not my genre. I've gotten better with like the slashers. I'm married to the biggest John Carpenter fan, so like I had to watch The Thing. I had to watch Halloween's. Like I've gotten better with it, but I refuse to watch like the Paranormal Activities and the shit that like I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I believe enough to not fuck around with it. It's how I look at it.
Something that feels like weirdly plausible is something, and that's something that a great horror movie can do. It can take a fantastical concept and can really ground it in such a way that you believe in the reality of the situation, and then something terrible happens. And that's actually something that I really like about Night of the Living Dead, where it's an apocalyptic movie, but it's on the first day of the apocalypse. It's the very first thing. All of a sudden, the dead are rising from their graves en masse to kill and devour the living. And then the living become dead, then become undead. And that's just it now. That's just our lives. And there's this human tendency we have to get used to just about anything. It takes a little while, but we can get used to anything. And we just accept it. It's like, well... Look! We just as of recording, like they just ended the COVID crisis legally, like from the government's perspective in America, and it's like people are still dying from it, right? Like it's still really bad, but they're just like, nope, we're used to it now. Screw it, and there's something just deeply horrifying about that. But the initial moment, that moment where you're everything in your life was normal. And then after this specific moment in time, everything in your life is horrible. That's we know what that's like. We know like when you get a phone call and then someone says, "Hey, something happened," and you're like, "Oh God!" and like you can just feel everything in your brain shut down because you knew something bad has happened. It's that, but with flesh-eating zombies. It's just it's that much worse. It's that much harder to wrap your head around, and it's really, really worth noting. It's really important to remember that when Night of the Living Dead came out in the 1960s, that wasn't a cliche yet. This invented that. I mean, they borrowed heavily from the Richard Matheson story, I Am Legend, which became Last Man on Earth and the Omega Man and the Will Smith movie. But that was about vampires. They were like, okay, that's cool, and we want to do that, but we don't want to rip it off and have to pay for that story. So we're going to do a slightly different thing. We're going to set it just at the beginning, and it's going to be ghouls. They never say the word zombie.
That was something that I thought was really... And so what was really fun is when I learned that, when we decided that we were going to do this, I told my husband, his immediate reaction was, the first way you're watching this movie is on Shudder at the last drive-in with Joe Bob Briggs. It's 3 hours long with him cutting in and out.
Okay.
But that was one of the things that he had mentioned that I thought was so interesting was that he was at the idea that they were ghouls. They weren't zombies. Zombie was not a thing when this movie came out.
Zombie, they would eventually use zombie in a Night of the Living Dead movie, but I don't think they used that word until Diary of the Dead in the 2000s. Romero's films, it was never like, no one was ever pulled back enough from the situation to apply a comfy label like that. And you got to remember that before zombies took over as like this sort of concept, which I think wasn't until the 80s that truly became codified. Zombie, that's a real thing. That's a cultural thing. There were actual movies in Hollywood about voodoo and zombies. There's a White Zombie with Bela Lugosi. There's a really amazing movie called I Walked with a Zombie, which is an adaptation of Jane Eyre, but with a zombie.
Okay.
Which, if you've ever read Jane Eyre, you're like, how does that work? And then you realize, oh, if that person's a zombie, it all makes sense. Boom. Great. It's a great movie. It's really weird, but it's great. But yeah, no, this idea of just every human being who is dead coming back to kill us all, it is biblical. There's something, there's allusion to that kind of thing in the Bible, but there's something that just is pure and simple and visceral about it. And utterly hopeless. It completely changes the paradigm of the world in which we live. And what I think is really amazing about it is that, in addition to just being a great movie, and we'll talk about all the details, it ignites the imagination, and it asks you, what would you do? That's something this movie does over and over again. There are characters who are debating what to do. What's the best course of action? What's the safest course of action? What's the most acceptable risk to take?
And then in the end, none of it, because
not really.
At the end of the day, because we might as well hit the spoilers now. At the end of it, they all dead. So
no one. The only people who make it out are characters we don't really know, who, they're just wandering death squads. That's probably not good.
Probably not.
That's not a good sign.
Probably not.
No, because it's a film about horror is often, not exclusively, but horror is often about hopelessness. Horror is a medium, a genre through which we explore our fears and anxieties. And there are lots of horror movies in which, good conquers evil, humanity prevails, we overcome our fears. But I think a lot of our more pervasive senses of dread suggest to us that there is no hope, that there is hopelessness in the world. And I think a lot of the horror movies that have a really profound impact on the audience accept that bleakness as something worth dramatizing. And while not every single Night of the Living Dead movie would be as much of a bummer as this, most of them would. Almost all of them, actually. But this is just I don't know. It's weird to me to look back and look at some of the reviews of the time of people who thought this wasn't interesting. There were definitely people who did. There were people who thought this was immediately exciting filmmaking. But then there were just people who were just like, it's kind of stupid. And I'm like, really? This is absolutely riveting from start to finish. Right.
And I think it's always fun to kind of look into and research things. One of my favorite things to find out when, especially movies that are made in the time that Night of the Living Dead was made, is where within the MPAA was this, where on the timeline was this movie. So for example, Red Dawn was at a point where, because of the gore and everything from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and all that, it was one of the first ones to get the PG-13 rating because of that. For here, there was no MPAA. And kind of going into, fast forwarding a little bit into my little, if it's on Wikipedia, it's true information. I think it's Ebert, who of Siskel and Ebert, who was writing for a paper in Chicago at the time. It was one of the two of them was shaming parents that were taking their children into seeing this movie.
Well, because here's the thing. This movie came out right on the cusp of when the Motion Picture Association of America started introducing the rating system as we know it now, which was a little different at the time, but was basically similar. G, PG, R, X. Before it was appropriated by the adult film industry, and then they never really figured out what to do with that rating. But this was coming out at a time when the film industry had stopped being quite so throttled by the Production Code, which had been instituted in the 1930s as a system of self-censorship, and it was very severe. Amazing movies came out under that censorship, but there were a lot of things that were just not allowed to be discussed, put on camera. And we were starting to get, towards the tail end of the 50s and of the 1960s, people just stopped caring so much. And we realized that was kind of optional. No one's really coming after us if we do anything violent. The indie boom was starting to release a lot more, a lot more violent grindhouse type material. And so, yeah, there was a lot. You could just release a movie in theaters and theoretically anyone could go see it. And so, yeah, eventually they released that. But Night of the Living Dead, like a lot of this movie, a lot of it is pretty tame by moments.
Oh, absolutely. I would agree.
A lot of it's very dire, it's very striking, it's very scary and suspenseful, but there actually are only a few key moments of real gore. And they're mostly towards the end. And they are really gross.
Yes.
Like, there's some really gross, like, when you see the way, when Romero films a zombie eating a person, they're not just like, oh, this is delicious. Yeah. They're like really just slurping down innards.
They're just like yanking out those intestines from Judy and Tom with justice for them.
And these were characters that we didn't know them terribly well, but we liked them fine. They were real people. They had literally just died. And then we're getting these like lingering money shots of ghouls just chomping on human innards,
ripping meat off of bones, and like literally like chowing down.
You get just some like smacking noises and the sound effects, and especially because we knew those characters and because they had only just died. In a moment where it seemed like everything might be okay, it really has a profound impact, and it feels, I think, even more grotesque than it actually is, which is, I think, something that great horror can do, where if you're invested, if you care about characters, then what happens to them really matters to you, even if it isn't. Some people go to horror movies for the gore. It doesn't have to be gory for it to be effective.
Right.
It can be, and I love gore as much as the next person when it's done right. But here, the great best of both worlds. And Romero would up the gore ante so much in the years that followed. The climax of Day of the Dead, which is actually my favorite in the whole series, is one of the most gruesome things I've ever seen in a movie. Just people being like ripped to shreds by zombies and yelling, "Choke on them!" Like as they're eating, they're watching their bowels get eaten, and you're just like, that's
how I would go out too.
That's dark. Okay, let's do it. Whoo!
No, that is it's very intense. I mean, even like going through that whole, because like when what I think this movie does so well in the sense of like defining like that genre of these horror movies and gore and this idea of like the undead, is that when the shit starts hitting the fan, it hits it and it just does not stop rolling. Like the end of of this movie is like anxiety to the nth degree of just here you are, and what ends up being the safest place in the house is locking himself in the basement, right? The one thing that they,
after a big old argument
about it, where he ended up
after big old
killing the guy over it, and then the guy ends up as he's down there dying, he dies. His daughter now comes back to life as an undead zombie or ghoul, and as he's walking, the mom walks down there and sees she's just eating her dad. Like, it's just the most like, it was
really scary.
And then you feel this sigh of relief as the night is over. It looks like Ben might be getting saved, and then not. And I'm just like, as I'm watching this and going through the photos at the end, I'm just like, fuck, because I went in completely blind. I knew nothing about it.
I was going to ask you about this because this is a movie. I'm sure I knew you heard of it, obviously, because it's just kind of ubiquitous. But I was curious because you hadn't seen it. What your idea of what the movie? Because we all have some idea when we haven't seen a movie and it's kind of talked about a lot. Like I have a general sense of what this is going to be. What did you think Night of the Living Dead was going to be versus what you actually saw?
A 1968 black and white version of an episode of The Walking Dead. And I was wrong. But I was also a little, like, a little bit, because that's where it's pulling from, right?
Entirely
Like, that's where, you know,
yeah.
that's what ends up, what the blueprint that George Romero leaves for all these other filmmakers and directors. And now, you know, you have like The Walking Dead and Fear the Walking Dead and all of these things, The Last of Us, like this blueprint he set to put all these out there. But what was so interesting was watching it and seeing like, okay, I'm seeing the beginning of something that is going to become a cultural phenomenon. And being able to see it now because of this podcast and go in as blind as I did, other than like knowing it's it's historically significance of it, was really, it sounds weird to say, but like it made it fun to watch. I'm like seeing where it's seeing, you know, the play be formed, the first thing that really kind of came out and what set the tone.
No, this is one of my favorite things about exploring film history, and it never stops, really. As long as you keep exploring, you're going to find, like, you know, you're going to watch this old movie from the 1930s, and then you realize, wait a minute, this is where, like, a storyline that, like, every sitcom has ripped off forever. This is, like, the first movie to ever do that. And all of a sudden, everything just sort of snaps into place, and you realize, wow, this history is really neat. And you get to, like, really explore. And yeah, Night of the Living Dead, it introduced ghouls. I think it made survivalism in horror a much bigger element of the genre than it had been previously. The idea of hunkering down, being besieged, fighting for who gets to lead the group, realizing that life as you know it is over, that you were in middle management means nothing now, and it's whoever is actually capable of surviving when the chips are down and we're all going to die. That's what matters. It's what happens when society completely falls away, and all that matters now is survival, because we're no longer in very suddenly at the bottom of the food chain.
And
all these things are really,
and what's even more interesting is kind of you had kind of said it earlier, is how relatable all of those things are even to today. You know, we mentioned, you know, COVID officially being over by the government's eyes. When you look at the interview in this movie, when they're interviewing the government officials, talking about it, and one guy is saying, this is the issue. It is this satellite that exploded and caused all this radiation that's what's causing. And then someone going, oh, no, not really. And it's like, well, we can't say that for sure. It literally threw me back to watching Trump in a press conference calling it the China virus, and like doing all these things that he was doing. And it's like, holy shit, we're like, that was 2019, 2020. We're watching the exact same thing happen that is put in this movie, and how realistic. And I think it brings up, that's what I started thinking about too, was like listening to these reports. I'm just like, fuck, like it hit so much harder because of living through what we lived through and are still living through over these last 3 years.
When you live through an extreme circumstance or time period, all of a sudden things that movies, for example, that you may have watched before, but all of a sudden you realize, oh no, this hits really hard. Like, people are actually making art about something really meaningful. And these moments of sort of sudden cultural panic when a disaster occurs, Night of the Living Dead taps into that real nicely. But it does so in this really... the characters in this movie are very isolated. We're not seeing what's happening in New York City, where there are millions of people, probably mass panic constantly. We eventually see stuff like that in Dawn of the Dead, but in this movie, it's very rural. People, you know, if they'd stuck around and listened to the radio, they'd have had a hint. But what would they really have known? Not very much. They're very kind of trapped out on their own. That level of not knowing what's really going on, that's genuinely terrifying. And honestly, I think even just the idea that this is a space virus is kind of just in here just so that the audience stops asking that question.
What brought them back to life. Yeah.
So you give them some theory to go on, because the movie doesn't care.
Yeah.
It's not about solving the problem. It's not about scientists in a bunker trying to find a cure for the virus. Eventually we get something kind of like that in Day of the Dead, but it's not about that. It's just about the immediate horror of it. And I love the opening of this movie. The opening of this movie scared the living crap out of me because it feels like a dream where it's a brother and sister and they're just bickering. They just have a life. And they go to visit a graveyard where I think their father is buried. And he just realizes she's scared in graveyards and starts making up some BS story about how some guy off in the distance, oh yes, he's the living dead.
Way that
he's coming to get you, Barbara.
The way that he said it too. He's coming to get you, Barbara. Like, it was horrifying. With the music under
one of the all-time line deliveries. Yeah. But here's the thing. Here's the thing that's absolutely terrifying. He was right. That actually is, like, what are the odds of that?
Right.
What are the odds of that? What, seriously, are you kidding? And part of me thinks that, like, you know, on a big enough sample size, like if aliens landed in 5 minutes, okay, someone right before the UFOs sort of came down would have just said something ironic about Mars. Right. Or going to outer space or something like that. And then the UFOs would have landed and everyone would look at that person like, this is all your fault.
They come in peace, right?
You know, but it's just a coincidence, but it's so kind of beautifully horrifying that something completely random would turn out to be true. I mean, if you had given me that screenplay and said, what do you think? I would say, I don't know about this opening. Because it feels like a hell of a coincidence. And I would have been wrong to question that because it is, for me, it's one of the scariest things about the movie. And when I'm watching this as a kid, it reminded me of, I'm not going to ruin it for you, but there's a really amazing movie in the 1950s. It was remade in the 80s. The remake's okay. The original is better, called Invaders from Mars. And there is one plot point in that movie that I saw when I was a kid that scared the living hell out of me. And it didn't really have anything to do with the monsters per se. It was just, it made me question things in a way that I was deeply uncomfortable with. And something about the original Night of the Living Dead and just how bizarre and random its opening is just weirdly perfect. And in horror especially in horror where you're not really confined to a lot of rules like this one is, they really weren't setting a lot of rules down. You have that freedom to be nightmarish. You have that freedom to be dreamlike. We're not mad at you for it because it is so effective. So.
Yeah. I mean, and talking about that whole opening, I mean, the one thing that I think this movie also does really well that they scored it perfectly. So when the movie is opening and you're watching that car drive, it's not like sunny day music playing as we're going on a leisurely, like, it is ominous. It is terrifying. It is leaving when you get to the sign that says cemetery ahead and it looks like there's like blood splattered on the sign, like, you know, shit is about to go down. Like, there's no you don't have music like this as like your opening score if it's going to end up happy.
What's funny is that because this movie was so cheap, this is a low budget production, completely independent. Before this, George Romero had done sort of industrial movies, which we don't really see so much of anymore, but things like how to avoid workplace catastrophes, and you see this at work or whatever like that. Just unartistic types of films.
Lift with your knees, not with
another
your neck.
filmmaker. Another filmmaker named Herc Harvey, who directed a lot of things like Why Should I Study Industrial Arts? And you'd like watch this in high school. He did countless ones of those, and he would end up making one of the best horror movies of all time called Carnival of Souls, which came out in the 60s as well. And it was basically, George Romero was kind of do the same thing. Listen, I've got all of this experience. I think he even shot like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He had all of this experience, and he was just like, well, let's make an independent movie, and horror sells, so let's just do this horror movie. And so they made it really, really cheap. And one of the things they did to cheap out was that music that's so effective. A lot of it comes from another movie.
Right.
It wasn't even made for this. It was for Teenagers from Outer Space, which sucks. That's a terrible movie. It's kind of delightful in its terribleness, which if you've never seen it, a teenager from outer space lands outside of a small town because his planet wants to use Earth as like a free range kind of farming planet for giant lobsters.
Sounds very, very interesting.
And this teenager from outer space is like, well, I don't know. There's a lot of people here, and the other teenagers from outer space, and they all look like they're in their 40s.
Of course.
All of them are just like, well, we don't care about people. And he's just like, well, I care, and I'm the hero now. Man, he runs off, and he falls in love, and guy tries to track him down. Sure. And in the end, they have to fight like the shadow of a lobster because we're not
going to make an actual giant lobster.
It's a very stupid film. They did an MST3K episode about it, but it's fun, but it's stupid. Awesome. It's just fascinating to me that the music from this very bad movie could just be used to so much better effect.
Yeah, exactly.
It's genuinely good here. You wouldn't know that so much of the music from this movie wasn't created for it, just because it works. It fits so well.
You mentioned, I think one of my favorite facts about this movie is the fact that it was made for just around $100,000 and grossed worldwide upon its release upwards of, I want to say, I think they said it like around 18 million or something like that. Yeah, like 18.6 million.
That sounds about right. Yeah. I don't have the figures in front of me.
Like 18.6 million worldwide, making it of the time one of the most profitable movies of the time that ended up going into public domain because the original
they fucked that up.
Because the original production company when they changed the name and became and it went to like Image 10, they just didn't put the copyright label.
You're supposed to have the copyright information on the credits. It needs to be like on the product. And if it's not, technically that's in public domain. So they had a title card. They changed the title to Night of the Living Dead, and someone who I assume was very much fired had left off the copyright information, which is why Night of the Living Dead is available on every streaming service. It's been made available in every single format from a wide variety of people. Oftentimes it looks like crap because you can just take a VHS, scan it, and release it, and you're legally allowed to. You'll also find Night of the Living Dead in a ton of motion pictures. Whenever like something needs to show on a television, well, if you're showing something that isn't in public domain, you probably have to pay someone for it. And then you have to pay them every single time it gets shown, and it adds up. Night of the Living Dead, on the other hand, you can just throw that on anywhere. You'll find that in White House Down. You'll find that in Bound. You'll find that in every movie. And it's glorious. And it has this wonderful, like, it kind of keeps the movie alive the way that some other films in the era just aren't. You don't incidentally run across movies. It used to be when like we were more beholden to just whatever was on television. We would chance upon things. I want to watch something right now. I'm limited myself to whatever is on. And even if I have cable, my options are limited to whatever happens to be on. And so we would just randomly stumble across older media more often because it was cheap to pick up and distribute, and often would play late at night. And so a lot of older movies, it's still things that we would watch and be very, very familiar with. And nowadays, because there isn't so much of that, whenever we stream something, we're probably picking and choosing what we want to see. And there's an inherent recency bias to that, and inherent recency bias to the streamers themselves, because that's what they're promoting. So a lot of older movies don't get seen as much. But Night of the Living Dead is just constantly available. It's been remade. There was an animated version. They did a extended cut, which was not good. And thank God, like Criterion, because at least for a while it was like, you recommend this movie, but I don't know what version you're going to watch. I don't know what distributor you're going to see it from. It might look like crap. And then thank goodness Criterion came along, and I think there's, I want to say the UCLA archive, but it might not be them. But they cleaned this thing up nice.
That's the second. That's
always a good looking movie.
That's the rewatch that I did today. Is we have it on. My husband owns it on the Criterion Collection. It was like, it was from like the Museum of Modern Art, and then like with donations from like, I think like George Lucas helped with like remastering it into this 4K version of it, and it was so great to watch again this time around on the Criterion version of it, to see it more crisp, more clean.
less interrupted by Joe Bob Briggs.
Which I'm still glad. I thought it was fun to do, just to kind of like get some fun info with it as I was watching it, because I always plan on going back and watching it again because of that reason. But it also made me feel like my facts that I pulled from Wikipedia are correct, because he also said that.
But this movie, because of this movie's enormous popularity, because George A. Romero made so many sequels to it and did so many interviews, I interviewed him shortly before he died. A lot of the history of this movie is pretty well documented. And as a result, there's a lot of info out there. A lot of it's really interesting.
And there's a lot of reasons why these, late night horror hosts, every single horror host has done it. Like you have your Sven Gulis, your Elvira's, like everyone's done a Night of the Living Dead in one way, shape, or form.
And you should. I miss those, honestly. I'm glad we have Joe Bob, but I that was always one of my dream jobs. I wanted to be a horror host on late night television. And that's not really a gig you can get anymore.
No, it was really funny because Sven Gulli showed up and they had a little like chat about like his career and all that. It was very interesting. I fast forward through a little bit of that because I was like, okay, let me get to the movie because we're not talking about Night of the Living Dead anymore. But there's so many interesting things to pick up on when you're researching it, because like once I'm into it, now I gotta dive in and I gotta know everything and I gotta try to pick up on as much as I can. I think it's so interesting the way that this whole movie was made is it's literally just George A. Romero and friends production with some local people and amateur actors. Again, you're keeping costs down. Dwayne Jones as, Ben is just phenomenal. I think it's just, he's absolutely incredible in it. And even though like it wasn't Romero's point, but again, coming in 1968 and being released on the heels of the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, people started kind of drawing those parallels with how Ben died. Because it was one of those things too, where like you don't have a Black actor in a lead role in the way that he was at that time.
No. Very uncommon. I've heard it said, and this is one of those things that's very hard to prove. I've heard it said that Dwayne Jones was the first Black actor to star in an American movie in a role that wasn't written for a Black actor.
Okay.
It was just a character in the film. They didn't really have a plan for it, and Dwayne Jones just gave the best audition, and they gave it to him. Again, that's hard to prove that no one ever did that before, but that's the story. But with that added level of texture, with that level of context, when you see Dwayne Jones, a capable, intelligent young man, bickering with a very conservative, white, middle class, angry man who doesn't like it when people tell him no, it adds that level of cultural context. It adds that level of subtext, if not text. And at the end of the movie, those pictures at the end, the way that they choose to end it, they choose not to film it all. I think that was a cost-cutting measure, but I'm not 100% on that. It looks a lot like pictures that you would see in the news of lynchings. And that's really quite horrifying. And I talked to George Romero about this as well, and he was like, listen, he said that they like had already like filmed the movie and were like shopping it around when they heard about the Martin Luther King assassination. It really wasn't something that they had done intentionally. And he said that if he had thought of it, he would have leaned into it even harder.
That's why George Romero is amazing.
When you watch the other Night of the Living Dead movies that he made, you'll see that he leans a lot more heavily into cultural commentary. Dawn of the Dead is very explicitly about commercialism. Day of the Dead is much more about political paranoia. Land of the Dead is a lot more about class disparity. Survival of the Dead is actually, I think it's really underrated, and it's all about like the way that we culturally deal with death, which has changed dramatically over the last 125 years or so. And then there's Diary of the Dead, which is just crap, but
can't all be winners.
I don't mean to be too dismissive. I don't mean to be too dismissive, but that was his attempt to do a found footage film, and it feels like he didn't really have an idea beyond what if I did it as a found footage film.
Right.
And so that was kind of annoying. But yeah, no, he realized that the allegorical power of this, and he leaned much harder into it in the future. But just by casting Dwayne Jones, and just because Dwayne Jones, gave such a potent performance, and just because the story played out the way that it does, it feels so much more artistically resonant than it would have if they had cast probably anyone else who auditioned. Yeah. So yeah, it's an incredible, and it just shows you like how every creative decision, even if it wasn't like intended from the beginning, every creative decision you make in a movie has a big ripple effect. Sure. And there are no small choices. Every single thing you do adds up and matters.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I think this is one of those movies where it's everything that was done in such a way that it was so smart and worked on such a grand level that there's a reason why people still talk about it to this day, and it's created the genre that it has. And did George A. Romero think that was going to happen at the time?
Oh, I guarantee not. I don't think he did at all. But
now here we are.
Because he went on to do different kinds of movies. He would made a witchcraft movie. He made The Crazies. He did a great movie that only just got released, like I think 2 years ago, called The Amusement Park, which is just one of the most depressing and frightening in a very unexpected way movies I've ever seen. And it's just an allegory for elderly abuse.
Okay.
And the way that society doesn't care for people who are elderly anymore, and how just incredibly difficult it is just to live when you've aged out of what people consider to be typical social behavior. He had an interesting career, and he would do all these interesting things, but the zombie movies were the things that paid the bills. Right. And so he kept coming back to them over and over and over again.
Because why bite the hand?
Sorry, I have to pet
I love that there's a cat. This is I think this is one of the first like actual pet cameos in an episode of Reels, like the first time. So that's very exciting. We love that.
Well, this is my cat Luca.
Hello, Luca.
He's a black cat and he's very cute.
Luca, what?
And my other cat Dante. Yeah.
Luca, what are your thoughts on the Night of the Living Dead? Are you a big fan?
I like the part where they eat snacks.
Perfect. We love that.
I think it was human flesh, buddy.
Yeah.
Delicious. Okay.
That's
fine.
Also, what I think is also really interesting about, again, looking into like the history of the film and how when George Romero was writing it, they were originally writing, again, this is back to my if it's on Wikipedia, it's true thing. They were originally penning a horror comedy with the working title of Monster Flick. That was the early screenplay was around the exploits of adolescent aliens who visit Earth and befriend human teenagers. Was the original concept that it came from.
They probably chose wisely.
Probably. But then it added into, then the second version of the script featured a young man who runs away from home and discovers rotting human corpses that aliens use for food scattered across the meadow. Yeah. And then we come into what becomes Night of the Living Dead. Which I think is hilarious.
These things evolve.
I love
they evolve. They evolve over time.
We love that. When you think of so with this movie, with Night of the Living Dead, what would your, in any order, your top 3 scenes and moments from this movie, what would they be?
Well, I think the opening is my personal favorite, just because it is. Hold on, I'm going to put you down.
Okay. Bye, Luca.
I love the opening. I think the opening, "They're coming to get you, Bob." That's just one of the great horror movie openings. It's so perfect. Let's see here. God, I don't know. It's that's actually, I wasn't really prepared for that. I would say it's definitely the opening. It's definitely the ending, which, as I said, really was very. I don't think I had seen a film with that bleak an ending.
Yeah.
When I saw this movie, I probably saw this movie when I was like 10, and it really just messed with me. So that ending was a big deal. Um, and then it's got to just be that really stark, haunted image of just corpses in their underwear munching on human flesh.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just it. There'd been cannibalism movies. There'd been undead movies. Hell, Vincent Price had been in an adaptation of I Am Legend called The Last Man on Earth, which is quite good, actually. Very respectable, and has a lot of similarities, a lot of barricading doors from like hordes of the undead. And but there's something about just the viscera.
That horrifying thing of like
And
you're looking out the window and you're watching people
Yeah.
walking slowly towards you. And you're just like, this is it.
No rush. They have all the time in the world.
You don't, but now it's slowly happening.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, just knowing that they're gonna eat you.
Yeah.
It's only a matter of time. Oh. That's it. They're just gonna whittle you down, and eventually that'll be that. They can't be reasoned with. They can't be. They might maybe could distract them, and maybe you could take them in a one-on-one fight, but they'll forever outnumber you.
Always.
There are more dead people on this planet than there are alive.
And I think that's the scariest thing too, is that if something like that would ever happen, we really all would be fucked. Like when you think about the amount of just dead human remains scattered around planet Earth.
Again, it's an idea that is so simple and easy to film too, which is very, very key. Because there's a lot of great movie monsters out there, but they require a certain amount of technical craft in order to make them look good on camera. This is one of the reasons why we really don't have all that many great werewolf movies.
Sure.
There's a few, but a lot fewer than we have vampires, I think, or zombie movies, because the effort it takes to make a convincing-looking werewolf is more trouble than it's worth.
Right.
Especially when you like a lot of like stories that we might associate with like a werewolf, like someone like wrestling with the killer within. You could just tell a serial killer story and you could save a lot of money on makeup.
Or save a lot of money on CGI, because that's where everything ends up going anyway.
Exactly. So zombies, depending on how fresh the zombie is, might not need a lot of makeup at all. You know? And as a result, all you need is basically a decent number of extras. Right. And that got a lot of copycats going. We had a few in the 70s, and then after the success of Dawn of the Dead, that really exploded. It's something you can easily film. It's a premise that all you got to do is like, okay, there's a zombie uprising. Pick a location. Pick a few characters we haven't seen before in that situation. Boom. That's it. Yeah. That's all you need for a movie. And you can tell infinite number of great movies in that scenario. And what I love about it is that it helps that the movie was in public domain, but even so, there are certain horror movie concepts. They don't come along very often. But when they do, all of a sudden, everyone in the audience goes, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't need to be sold on this. The dead, there's no more room in hell. The dead are coming back. I don't need to be sold on that. I think the last time I saw like everyone just sort of accept what should be a bizarre premise was The Purge.
Yeah.
And when The Purge is basically like, okay, what if there was one night a year where all crime is legal and people just run out killing each other? And I think everything in our brains, we're so cynical about society that everyone in the audience was just like, I buy that.
And how the only way to survive is to be rich as shit. And it's like one of the first, like a real great Eat the Rich movie.
Yeah. It's a great. I think the Purge movies are the modern equivalent of the Night of the Living Dead movies. I think they've got inherent social commentary baked into it, but they've also just you could make them. I've seen people rip them off very, very easily. It's just they're easy to make. They have an infinite potential for variety, just caked into the basic premise, and everyone in the audience accepts it because it feels right.
Right.
It feels like this is what's happening. And honestly, the more politicized those movies gets, the more right it felt, because it's just like, yeah, that's how polarized everything is right now. So yeah, horror as social commentary. If you can find a horror premise that you can project almost any social commentary onto, and especially if you can do it cheaply, you got a winner.
100%. And I think that's what this movie does so incredibly well by the different people that you're bringing in. You have Barbara, who is just horrified and doesn't know what to do and is just losing her mind. You have Judy and Tom, who are like very level-headed, trying to like be that peacemaker in that Switzerland. You have Ben, who's like, no, I'm a leader. This is how we're doing it. But then you also have Mr. Cooper.
I think it's Mr. Cooper.
And he's like, I got to protect my family. We're doing it this way. So you have the two, you know, power people struggling in between. And it's really is that commentary on like, how are we trying to bring people together in times of crisis to survive? And how is everyone going to handle it? I'm probably going to be a Barbara, and I'm just going to sit there and lose my shit. I'm going to be honest.
I've often joked that as a film critic, when like, if like the shit hits the fan and we're like stranded on a deserted island, I'm the first person who's going to be killed.
100%.
I have no use.
I literally am like,
so, I'm fine with that. I made my choice. But that's the thing though, is also, and that's something we haven't really talked about, is this idea of when the entire world is against you, every group of people becomes a microcosm of society. And the bickering, the infighting, the struggles for power, the resentments that turn into animosity, that turn into something that can destroy us all of those things get elevated from just, this is how two people interact, to this is how everyone interacts. And Romero would do this constantly. Almost every single one of his movies is about people trapped in a pressure cooker situation. And so many movies, zombie movies, but even beyond, would start taking that premise. And yeah, there have been plenty of pot boilers, people then in single locations, but the idea of using that for horror social commentary was relatively fresh. And I feel like nowadays, when we harken back to that, we're really mostly going back to the Night of the Living Dead.
And I love that was one thing. And again, one thing I didn't know that it was all going to take place in one location. And I think that builds into the claustrophobia of it all, is we're now stuck in this house. We're slowly getting surrounded. We're slowly watching things, you know, maybe if we weren't all sitting there arguing back and forth about where was the safest place to be, we could have gotten gas in this truck much sooner before, you know, like there's all these little things that just could have.
It's easy to Sunday drive. And again, that's that activates your imagination. You're saying, what would I do in that situation? I posted a poll on Twitter. I don't know if you saw it when I was rewatching this the other day. And I was like, let's just settle this once and for all. In Night of the Living Dead, are we safer upstairs or are we safer in the cellar?
Yeah.
Because when you hear Ben make his pitch for why it's safer upstairs, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, it's you get clear sight lines to everything going on outside. There's a potential to escape. And then when Mr. Cooper just says, yeah, but the cellar is more fortified and there's only one entrance and it's easier to prevent them from getting in. But the thing is, Ben is someone we want to follow.
Right.
He's handsome. He's well-spoken. He's confident. He's intelligent. He's got all of these leadership qualities that is just like, yeah, let's follow Ben. And then it turns out the only reason Ben survives is by hiding in the damn cellar.
And how often do we end up following the person that seems the most charismatic and the most put together and the most like just because he's speaking to everybody. If we just work together, we could make it work up here. It's not me that's the problem convincing everybody. You're the problem by not wanting to work with me.
Yeah. And we'll see other movies deal with this. I think the best movie, even better than this, to ever deal with that kind of, okay, we're all trapped in this and people are starting to choose sides and pick a leader. I think the scariest version of this movie ever is The Mist.
Yes.
Which has one of the most fucked up endings in movie history. Also one of the best, if you ask me. And I think it's really, really smart. And even Stephen King agrees it's a better ending than his story. This isn't a story about we picked the right leader and everything turned out okay. It's not even a story about how, oh no, we followed a charismatic leader and that was our downfall. Right. You were screwed no matter what you did.
Yeah.
There was no getting out of this. You were, maybe there's theoretically a way to handle it. And in the remake, which they made because they could finally copyright it, they did make some other choices and that's kind of interesting. But in this original, it's just about being completely screwed. Right. It is about looking outside at the world, seeing how violent and antagonistic and how horrible things have gotten, and that will win. All you can do is try to last as long as you can. And God, that's depressing. Feels real though, doesn't it?
Sure does. I mean, I feel like that's exactly what we've been doing for the last 3 years at this point, when you really think about it.
Yeah, and the idea of comparing human beings to a mindless horde.
Right.
That's not new.
Right.
It's pretty literal in this case. It had been done before cinematically. Invasion of the Body Snatchers was a bit more on the nose with its politics.
Yeah.
But
I love your response to that tweet, by the way, with your cellar, which one is safest?
Oh yeah, because everyone said it's upstairs, and I'm like,
clearly you haven't watched it, but if you need me, find me in the cellar.
No, what's the movie? The cellar is like, I know the guy arguing for the cellar was an asshole, and I would never want to hang out with them in real life. He happened to be right. Like sheer coincidence. It's like that Onion article. Oh no, the worst person you know just made a good point. In fact, I think the guy in the picture that they used for that article looks a bit like Mr. Cooper.
That's so funny. That's hilarious.
But yeah, it's just
yeah. I would have to say, so my favorite parts, I think, you have that iconic thing of the beginning and then of course the end. One of the moments I really liked, and I think it kind of took me aback, was when Karen gets reanimated as an undead, and her mom comes into the cellar and she's eating her dad. And then you just watch her laying there as Karen just takes that garden spade and just is, I mean, you want to talk about gruesome and gory, watching her, the mother side, I think is what it was called on Wikipedia. That whole scene of just like watching, like, all you know is, because at that point too, we didn't know that getting bit was going to turn you into somebody.
Not a guarantee. No,
we had no idea of knowing it. And I think that is one of those things where, looking at it now, I'm assuming that's what's going to happen just because of my history of knowing like zombie and undead stories, that was going to happen. But right now, all they know from the news is that if you die, you come right back as an undead unless you've been shot in the head or burned. And that the dead are rising up and eating people to turn them into undead. But there is nothing about if you get bit that
it's not about being an infection.
Exactly. And I think that was saving that all the way to the end. I think then you're like, fuck, everybody's screwed. Like, you can't do shit.
Yeah.
Goddamn. Like, this is it.
No, it's a real bummer. And it really calls attention to the idea that to survive, because I think watching a zombie movie, there's so many characters within a zombie movie, because the whole premise of most zombie movies is that most people aren't mentally prepared to go into zombie survival mode. They're human beings. And like when you see, oh no, my friend Steve is bitten by a zombie. Now he's a zombie. And I'm like, Steve, are you in there? Like, no, like everyone in the audience, like, no, just kill Steve.
Shoot him in the head. Do it.
It's easy for you to be objective about this because you're watching a movie.
Right.
Within the narrative, people trying to maintain their humanity, that's a noble thing. And indeed, we see in later installments of the Living Dead series, in particular Land and Survival, that there was actually something to that. That there was actually some hope. Actually, and Day of the Dead as well. That maybe the dead, maybe that wasn't the end of it. Maybe there was hope for, if not humanity to go back to the way it was, then to find some new way of being. But it's kind of ironic that in order to save humanity in these kinds of movies, the people who are best equipped to survive are the people who can most easily dehumanize the dead or the infected. And that's something very cynical about that. And I don't think it's something that we should be too laudatory of.
And I think it's one of those things too, like looking into like modern day iterations of this kind of thing, as you look at, I think, that everyone's kind of talked about a lot. I really enjoyed it, is like, you look at like HBO's The Last of Us, where all these people, a ton of these people are, I mean, just like at any, or even like, there's not a whole lot of good people, but you feel like you have to root for like the least amount of bad in a person. But you have to, you're kind of at this point where when you're in that moment, Ben is a hero, but also, is he, because of how he reacts to Mr. Cooper towards the end? But it's like, he's doing the best that he can. So that whole idea of like, you're stuck in this, really the good people were Tom and Judy, who get blown up in the car, and hashtag justice for them. They deserved better. But
they tried to save people. Like they tried to save Ben by driving up.
Yeah.
It didn't go well, but yeah, they
exactly.
tried.
So it's this whole idea of like trying that whole, the only people, like you said, the only people who are going to survive are the people that can separate the person from, no matter how much you cared about them or where it was, you have to separate. Now here's where it's at, and we have to figure this out. And it sucks, but that's why if there's a zombie apocalypse, I'm just gonna lay under the bridge with a bunch of sleeping pills and just accept my fate. That's where we're going with it.
I have a bad knee, and that's the thing that worries me the most.
Right.
I'm just going to be the guy that's like, listen, I'm good as long as there's no running involved.
100%. If they're
as soon as there's running involved, I'm out. Take care. Don't even bother.
If they end up being fast good. Zombies, I'm really fucked. Like if they're like 28
fast zombies.
Zombies like
and it's weird. Actually, it's actually weird watching this one and seeing the zombies use tools.
Yes,
which is something that wouldn't be commonplace. I'm
like, and
it was actually a huge plot point in Land of the Dead that the zombies were remembering how to use tools. And this one, it's kind of just a thing. Yeah. It just they hadn't really codified some stuff,
which I think is again why I think this movie was so fun to watch as a blueprint, because like I'm not watching walkers in The Walking Dead picking up a rock and breaking a window, to like get at someone. Like they're standing there and they're banging on shit, but like they're also dodos and falling through the ceiling because they know that they can't tell that it's been rotten, and like they're just really mindless. Where in this is like we're still like there's still something going on upstairs enough to be able to use tools and figure out what they're going to do. I think my favorite one was at the end after they all broke into the house, the one that's like walking around with like it looks like it's like a walking stick. She's just like banging the table leg on the floor.
Yeah. That's something that Romero would discuss in, I think, Dawn of the Dead, the idea that in the absence of like immediate stimuli, like something to eat, they start kind of defaulting to like patterns of behavior, like subconscious patterns of behavior that we have as adults. And that's why in Dawn of the Dead, all of the living dead just go to the mall. That's what they do. That's like, what do you do when you turn off everything in the brain except eating, and that's it? Like, what else? What other impulses left? I don't know. You want to go to the mall? Yeah, let's go to the mall. And they all go to the mall.
I love that. That's amazing. I definitely do. Yeah. I do need to go. I'm definitely going to go back and watch like kind of like the rest of really, especially doing like Dawn and Day. I definitely think are two that I really need to revisit for.
I would say Dawn is a classic for a reason. It's actually not my favorite. I think Day is probably the most intense. That's like a panic attack of a movie.
Cool, great.
Land of the Dead was the one like where Romero had money.
Gotcha.
And it's actually like a kind of an epic, and it's really good.
And that's kind of like that would be like kind of like his blank check film. Like the studio was like, here you go.
Yeah, a little bit.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Diary, it's not very good. Survival is really interesting ideas, and I don't think it should be slept on. Okay. I think that's a rock solid film. The other one to watch when you're watching these is I would recommend inserting. It's like I tell people, like when you're watching all the Star Trek movies in order, don't forget Galaxy Quest, because I actually think it kind of counts.
I love Galaxy Quest.
I love it too. I think it's a damn near perfect comedy. But if you're watching the Night of the Living Dead movies, don't skip out on Return of the Living Dead, which is a truly awesome zombie movie. And it's more of a comedy, but it opens with a couple of guys and they're working at like a warehouse, and they're talking about the events of Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead as this like isolated thing that happened, and then they made a movie out of it, and everyone just thinks it's a movie now. And then it turns out that they end up like releasing some zombie gas, and now everyone's screwed again.
Okay,
it's great. Awesome. It's really amazing monster effects in that movie, like really, really funny. And that was the movie, the Return of the Living Dead. That's the movie that codified the thing we all take for granted now, which is that zombies specifically eat brains.
Gotcha.
That's something everyone knows, like brains. George Romero never did that. That was never a George Romero thing. That was Return of the Living Dead. It's always interesting to me to see how things that pop up later in horror mythology eventually become kind of weirdly canonized. And now everyone thinks they were there from the beginning. Like the idea that Dr. Frankenstein had an assistant named Igor.
Right. Igor.
He didn't have an assistant named Igor in the book. And he didn't have an assistant named Igor in the movies until the third film.
Okay.
But we just accept Igor now. And that's brains and zombies are kind of the same thing. So
okay. No, it's good to know. I'm excited. I'm proud of myself for like opening up my horizons. And I'm definitely.
I'm glad you liked it. I was a little worried.
No, I. But again, it's like I say. I feel like, especially this time with all of these episodes, I'm getting introduced to movies that I never would have watched if it wasn't for this podcast, and I wouldn't. And even if I did watch it outside of this, if I didn't have this podcast, I don't think I would appreciate it for what it was. If I had seen Night of the Living Dead at the point of like watching it on TV, however many years ago or whenever it was. There's no way I would have any sort of appreciation or understanding for it like I do now, knowing a little bit of the history behind like George Romero and how it started and having like that little, just even having like that little bit of a background. And it's enough for me to realize what the historical importance of this film. And
that's what I think we need when we introduce people to older movies. Is a little bit of context really goes a long way, because you might just be astounded by what you see. I've seen plenty of older movies where I didn't really know anything about it, and the movie was just so damn interesting that I wanted to find out more. But, I grew up watching Turner Classic Movies and an AMC back when it stood for American Movie Classics instead of
whatever it is now,
The Walking Dead. But they would introduce movies with a critic or historian just saying, hey, here's what was going on at the time. Here's why this is relevant. Here's what to keep an eye out for when you're watching this movie. And it just kind of puts you in the right mindset to give something that really might not have intended to speak to your generation a chance and give it an opportunity to really speak to you. And I think Night of the Living Dead, because it is so isolated, because it's so dreamy, I think a lot of people probably could watch this cold and appreciate just how creepy it is.
Yeah.
And just really get into it. But I think when you fully appreciate this movie's very distinct place in history, and how, even though it didn't really invent its subgenre, again, you could probably give that to Richard Matheson, it codified it. And when people copy it, this is what they're copying. And I think that's really useful. And I think that's one of the best ways to explore film history, is to take something you already like from like whatever it is now and just see what influenced that, and then what influenced that, and what was going on at the time. So, and then again, this is one of the reasons why I like that you're doing this. I think this is a really useful thing.
Thank you.
To share the experience of learning more about movies and all of the different, because there's so much to learn. You could focus entirely on just one subgenre, and you could do hundreds of episodes.
Absolutely.
But trying to cover the entire gamut, which I think is noble, and I think you just got to start.
100%. And it's like, and I know for a fact that I'm not going to be able to watch every single movie under the sun. And I know that,
I'll never know.
And that's fine. But at the end of the day, if the reason I started this podcast is because of movies like Night of the Living Dead. I have other people, so, last week's episode, or an episode recently being A Ghost Story, was suggested by Ace Cabrera. Like, he was one who was like, I want to talk about this movie. And I said, cool, let's do it. Never would have watched it without this podcast. And I love that. But I'm also covering these movies that, like, what do you mean you haven't seen Night of the Living Dead kind of situation? Which is where it started. So being able to do that and then talk about it with people who love it and appreciate it, and, having you as the guest to talk about it, who, like you said, you've been able to sit down and interview George Romero about his career. And this is a very pivotal moment in his career, is what really is one of the big reasons why I wanted to bring this podcast to life. And, even if it gets, it's not even like with my tens of viewers that are watching that I love and appreciate, I'm okay with that. Like, because
it's fine.
I love that I'm getting to experience something for the first time, and of something that someone else loves, and they get the feeling of joy too that comes from like showing somebody something for the very first time that they love. And and like it opens horizons, and it's something that I've had people say, I never would have watched that movie if it wasn't for your podcast, which I think is really cool.
Doesn't that make all the difference?
It really does. It really does.
Yeah. When I hear just someone say, hey, you recommended a movie and I watched it, that alone is great. But then to hear that they liked it, even better. That's why I do what I do. Like, to be a critic, and you're doing it as well. You're a critic now, and this is
it.
You are. You're doing the work.
Thank you. That means a lot. That's probably the nicest compliment that I've gotten on this show.
Well, it's true. What do you call someone who does a film criticism podcast over and over again, trying to introduce themselves and other people to classics of cinema? What else can you call them but a film critic?
I will take it.
And
putting it in my bio.
And you have, and what I love about you is you have this sense of genuine curiosity. A lot of people can be very closed off in their idea of what film should be or what they do or do not need to know about it. And I think that's something that we need more people to see in action, is just curiosity shown to the world, and to be able to say, this is new to me, I didn't know it. And that's something, when people do that whole thing, oh, you haven't seen blank, there's a little indignation there that always kind of rubs me the wrong way, because for me, I think that's exciting because you get to see it for the first time. Every single person had to see something for the first time at some point. That someone is behind you or ahead of you on that journey is irrelevant. We want to encourage everyone to take that journey.
Absolutely. And
that's what I want to do. I want to encourage, because my life was changed for the better for having people, family, film critics, textbooks that I read, whatever, make cinema history exciting and illuminating and something that could enrich my life. And I want to be a part of that. And I see you being a part of that. And that makes me incredibly happy. And so, of course, I'm here.
Oh, thank you so much.
And I'm just thrilled to do it.
I appreciate that. I think with all those very kind words, because my love language is words of affirmation. So, like, the mood that I'm now in is fantastic. I think that's a great time for me to end the show towards how we always do, where I go into Letterboxd and I rate it out of 5 stars, and I'll add it to my list and everything. I mean, I knew I was probably going to do this. It's not, I don't want to call it a bias, but like, with everything that I've heard, with everything I knew about it, it was one that I was also a little bit nervous. It's that idea of like, will it live up to the hype of like how people talk about Night of the Living Dead? And it does. This is a 5-star film for being the blueprint of what to know the history behind it and what's come because of it. I can't rate this any less than 5 stars. This was an absolute blast to watch.
This is one of the great horror movies. This is one of the most pivotal horror movies. This is a movie that I think, there's a lot of great movies out there, but I think there are certain movies, and when I say certain, I think that I think everyone should try to jump through if you love movies, even if you're not a huge fan of the genre. And this is definitely one of them. I think it's a seminal work. And it holds up great. Yes. That's the other thing that's really cool about it. You don't even have to go, well, for the time. Like, no. Mm-hmm. Still scary.
Still very scary. That music,
still very scary.
If I'm walking into my house and it's dark and my husband plays that opening music as I'm walking in, I'm going to turn around and tell him to shut the fuck up. That's how scary.
And if he ever says they're coming to get you, Allison,
I'd punch him in the face. I'm like, here's the divorce papers. Stop
punch him and run.
Done. Yeah. Punch and run. Yeah. We're gone. Well, Bibbs, as I like for all of my guests, what you got going on? Where can everyone find you?
Oh, I have so much stuff. The usual things that I do. I write film criticism for The Wrap. I've been doing some writing for Slash Film lately. My main project is the ongoing critically acclaimed Network, which is a series of podcasts that I co-host with film critic Whitney Seibold. We review new movies on a show called Critically Acclaimed. We have just started a new series. We're actually recording this before the first episode airs, but by the time this airs, it'll be a few episodes in. We have a new show on the Critically Acclaimed Network, which is available on Spotify, Apple, etc., called Thank Godzilla It's Friday, where we are doing our own deep dive, and we're going to be reviewing every single film in the Godzilla series.
Amazing.
Including the ones that are only kind of tangentially connected. And by our current count, that's about 52. So it should take about a year to get through this thing. We also have a Patreon, and at patreon.com/critically acclaimed network, you can get episodes ad-free. You can get episodes of Thank Godzilla It's Friday a week in advance, so you can catch up that way. We also have exclusive shows called Only the Best, where we're reviewing every single film ever nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards in order. Only the Best International, where we're doing every single film ever nominated for Best International Feature at the Academy Awards. All our yesterdays, we're reviewing every single episode of Star Trek in order. We do commentary tracks, we do Discord hangouts. It's a lot of fun over there. And again, you sign up and you get like this huge back catalog of commentaries and podcasts to explore. So patreon.com/critically acclaimed network. Thank you everybody who's signed up already. And if you haven't, we'd love to hear from you. The other thing that I do, and this is just as important, is I help run the Salt Cat Soap and Paper Company with my partner, M. Lopez de Silva. That is a two-pronged soap company where we make and design soap. We have two ways to get it. One is our Patreon page, patreon.com/saltcatsoap. And that is a Soap of the Month club for U.S. residents. We ship out, depending on your tier, 1 or 2 designer soaps every single month. And we have polls. You can help us like design them, decide like what sort of aromatic profile we're going to have this year. Or we had one recently, which is which one of our cats do you want us to base a soap on this month? And it was Luca, and it was the theme was naps and snacks.
Love that.
So in addition to having a black cat in the middle of this like beautiful like white bar of soap, it's the overall fragrance profile is like fresh laundry, like kind of like this very fresh fabric smell. But we also crafted a whole bunch. It took forever of soaps that look exactly like gummy bears.
Nice.
And so we embedded that within the soap. So it's also a whole bunch of little soap gummy bears. That's so cool. In there. So that one's gone. But we also have you can get those every single month. And also we have a Ko-Fi store. Or is it coffee? I always forget.
No idea, but yeah, sure.
ko-fi.com/saltcatsoap, where we sell. We usually have some extras. We sell soaps. We sell stickers. You can get signed copies of my partner M. Lopez de Silva's novella. A whole bunch of stuff over there, and that one is the one where we ship internationally. So feel free to check that out. And they make great gifts. So I highly recommend checking them out. And I'm on Twitter. I'm on Twitter at William Bibbiani.
Awesome. We'll get links to all of that in the description, so you guys can go and join those Patreons, order those soaps. They are amazing soaps. I've ordered some myself. I love them very, very much. And of course, to all of my lovely viewers, again, thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you are watching on the Flick and Reel YouTube channel, please be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit that little thumbs up button. Really helps with the algorithm. Leave your thoughts in the comments of their on Night of the Living Dead. I am whiffing so many things. It is great.
You're doing great.
You're doing great. One take, no edits. It's great.
None.
If you're listening on your audio platform of choice, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review to Flick and Reel. You can follow me on Twitter at Allison Salamone, and you can follow the show as well at Reels Like Movies. And until next time, my friends, be safe. I'm going to go watch some more movies. Bye.